name is Randy Kluver. I'm the Dean of the School of Global Studies and Partnerships here at Oklahoma State University, and it's our delight to have you here this evening. This is part of the Global Briefing Series, a series of talks we do several times a semester to help bring prominent speakers to the campus of Oklahoma State so that we can better understand the challenges facing our time. Tonight's event is co-sponsored by the Department of Geography and the Department of Political Science, and we're very grateful for their participation. I'm going to turn it over to a representative of the College of Geography now, Dr. Ruel Hanks, to introduce our speaker. Dr. Hanks is professor of geography here at Oklahoma State. He's also the Don and Kathy Humphreys Global Studies Chair for the College of Arts and Sciences. So, Dr. Hanks.
Thank you, Dean Kluver. Yeah, so now we find out who the dedicated students are here on campus. You could have done Terry Crews across the way, but you're here. So we'll take note of that. I'll do something of a formal presentation or introduction for our speaker. Glen Howard is the president of the Jamestown Foundation, one of the world's leading research and analysis organizations on Eurasia. Based in Washington, D.C., Mr. Howard has overseen the research and analysis activities of Jamestown for the past 16 years and extensively dealt with Russia and Eurasia in his capacity as Jamestown's president, working with the regional leaders and national strategists across Eurasia from the Baltic to Central Asia. From 2002 to 2008, he served as the executive director of the American Committee for Peace in Chechnya, an organization consisting of prominent U.S. policymakers seeking a peaceful end to the Second Russo-Chechen War in Chechnya. An expert on Russia, Ukraine, Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Russian nationalities in the North Caucasus, Mr. Howard is the author of Volatile Borderland, Russia and the North Caucasus, and has published articles in the Wall Street Journal, Real Clear Defense, The Hill, and other publications. You may have seen him on CNN, the BBC. He's appeared on Radio Free Europe and in a number of other international media outlets. He worked at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow from 1984 to 86 and is fluent in Russian and proficient in French, Turkish, and Azerbaijani. I've known Glen Howard for more than 30 years. He received an undergraduate degree from here, Oklahoma State University, in business administration. I met him when he came to another university just north of here, the University of Kansas, where he and I both graduated in 1988 with a master's degree in Soviet and East European studies. Little did we know in 1988 that receiving that master's within a year and a half, that academic field of inquiry would become obsolete. But Glen, nevertheless, has continued on with his master's degree and done, well, I would say rather well. So, ladies and gentlemen, I give you Glen Howard.
Thank you, Ruel. It's a great pleasure and delight to be back here at Oklahoma State University. I've been back in a very long time, and it's I'm a classmate of Ruel, so it's also a great pleasure to see Ruel again, and to be able to talk to you tonight. I've been where you have been. I was born in Oklahoma. Grew up in Okmulgee, Oklahoma, and like many people, came to Oklahoma State. And I started off with a degree and finished a degree in business management. So, as you can see, life sometimes makes you, turns you in a direction you may not be expecting. So, if you're having problems deciding on what you're going to major in, don't worry. So, it's certainly one of these things that from where I've sat before, sometimes you will be influenced by people, professors, who will try to influence you to go in a certain direction, and it's the timing in life is everything. So I think that ended up my case, and I ended up going to Russia for 2 years, the Soviet Union in the 1980s. But I've sat where you've said, and I've heard people give lectures. You know, when I was here in the 1980s, there was a man by the name of George Jewsbury, who was an expert on a region called Bessarabia, which no one probably has heard of, but it's a region between Romania and Moldova. And it was a very hotly contested geopolitical zone between Russia and the Turkish Empire, or the Ottoman Empire back in the 19th century. And so I never gave thought to whatever Bessarabia was until recently, because that term is starting to become very popular again in some of the circles that deal with conflict, which is what Jamestown deals with. Now, Jamestown is a foundation. We write and conduct analysis. You can go to our website, www.jamestown.org, and you can get information for free, and you can get it and learn more about Russia, Eurasia, through the Eurasia Daily Monitor publication we have. And you can also learn about China, and we have terrorism as well, where we deal with those parts of the world. But the area that I've been dealing with most of my life has been Eurasia. And so at one stage it was Russia, or the Soviet Union, then that fell apart, now it became Eurasia. Now it's Central Asia, it's the Caucasus, it's the Black Sea region, it's Ukraine, it's Moldova, it's Belarus. I mean, it's these areas, parts of the map that if it's very, very critical that you have to know geography and look at maps, because there's been 3 wars fought in this region in the post-Soviet space since 1999. You've had the Russo-Chechen War, started in 95. The second one was in 99. Then in 2008, you had the Russo-Georgian War with the short conflict between Georgia and Russia. Then you have in 2014, you have the war with Ukraine, the annexation of Crimea by Russia, and then which was in February 2014. And then you follow by the war in Donbass and the invasion of Donbass in eastern Ukraine. So many of these places that you may have heard about and can somewhat recall still very much are on our radar screens. Now, I live and work in Washington, and one of the great benefits of being a student is you're here to study, and you get to go to the library, and you get to read, and some of you read, and some of you pay attention to your phones a lot. But it's very, very critically important for this aspect, because there are certain things that you can pick up here at the university, which you will not have a chance to pick up again later in life unless you decide that you want to become an expert in these areas, or you want to learn more about it. And today with the internet, you can become the expert. I mean, you can watch countless lectures on the internet. But the key thing here is that there's a phrase that I've used all throughout my life about what it is, because when I was sitting in your position, I dreamed of going to Washington, and I was trying to figure out a way to do it, and I wasn't sure how that path would go. But there's a famous phrase by Henry Kissinger, and he said, learn everything you can before you get to Washington, because once you get there, there's no time to think. Now, why is that phrase important? That phrase is extremely important because sometimes in the things that you read and you get thrust into everyday life in Washington and you get thrust into positions of policy and decision making, you're going to have to recall what that particular text, the things that you read, that in that knowledge and that mindset, you may be able to help you put that into a broader perspective. Now, that's history, and I'm sorry, but in this part of the world, when you're talking about U.S.-Russia relations, history is very, very extremely important. It's become even more important now, but unfortunately we're not learning it like the way we used to. But it's very, very critical in these areas because there is a movement of tectonic movement of the plates of Europe and Eurasia are moving in a way where there's going to be potential further conflict and instability that are going to affect Americans, and we need to get a greater understanding of it. We have to deal with this all the time in Washington. Now, my talk tonight is going to be about Russia, or is about the future of U.S.-Russia relations. Well, you know, that's a very difficult topic to write or even discuss about, because when we start talking about the future of U.S.-Russia relations, every U.S. president starts off thinking, okay, I'm going to go in, I've got a better negotiation position with Putin. You know, that Obama guy, yeah, he didn't know what he was talking about. Okay, I can do it. So this has been the perennial problem of American presidents that we faced in the last couple, and I'm not blaming either side here because Jamestown is supposed to be nonpartisan. But the problem here has been starting from the Bush administration after 9/11 to President Trump, down to Obama, and everyone has been characterized by the same way, thinking, well, we could just get to go, talk to them, and after 9/11, we were attacked in Afghanistan, and we need Russia, and so we've all been fooled by this and this desire and thinking that the Russians are like us, and they think just the way we do, and it's not necessarily true because they have their own culture, their own historical perspectives, and the way that they look at things differently than the way the United States does. And you only get that when you learn other nations' language and cultures and live in those countries, which I had the great benefit of doing when I lived in the Soviet Union in 1984 to 1986. But this has been a particular problem because where we're going with U.S.-Russia relations right now is down a course where it's steady and stable, but it's fraught with conflict, and there's a lot of potential in here for the United States and Russia to have further conflict with each other over some of these areas I was mentioning to you tonight. Ukraine, for example, is at the center of it. Now, one of the things that people constantly ask me is they say, well, how do you define Putin's Russia? And it's something that I've given a lot of thought to because I'm trying to figure out what is going on inside of Russia, because Putin is very much is well understood in the West, but he's also not well understood. And frequently my answer to that question is, how do you define Putin's Russia? I would say he's a modern day Bismarck with a touch of Brezhnev. And this is something, and Brezhnev for many of you was a Soviet Politburo leader from the Cold War. So what I'm trying to underscore is that there's a bit of European diplomacy, European statesmanship that President Putin represents, but it's also touched with the Soviet nostalgia, the view of the Soviet Union, and this view of Russia's role in the world and in Europe. And this is something that is very, very critical to kind of understand and try to figure out, because what we're seeing now are a series of limited wars inside of the periphery of Russia with its neighbors. We are now starting to see a NATO buildup in the Baltic. We have American troops on the ground. 4,000 Americans are on the ground in Poland. You have American troops based in each of the Baltic states in a very small contingent role. But now you're starting to see there's Canadians in Latvia. There's British military units in Estonia. And so all around the periphery of the former Soviet Union, especially in the Baltic, you're seeing the United States starting to play a very key and central role with security. And this is very important because there's something that Americans, and Henry Kissinger once said, another thing that he said is that when he retired, the one thing that he had wanted to teach Americans about, and because Henry Kissinger, for many of you who don't know, was in the Nixon administration, the breakthrough to China, key national security advisor, but he was also from Germany. He was a refugee, came to the United States, served in the U.S. Army at the end of the Second World War. But he was one thing he said about what he wanted Americans to learn, and that was what they called the European balance of power. Now, we just finished a World War I anniversary here. I'm sure many of you kind of caught a glimpse of some discussion of the World War I. And World War I was very important because, Americans sent the troops to Europe, to France to help fight. Part of that struggle was about the European balance of power. And that is one thing that Kissinger was trying to talk about and trying to emphasize when he talked to Americans, because what happens in Ukraine? Zbigniew Brzezinski, somebody that I used to work with and had the great pleasure of someone that I knew, said once that Russia cannot be an empire without Ukraine. And Ukraine is a very critical component of Russia's ability to trying to restore itself to great power status. Now, that doesn't mean anything to you, really. Ukraine, okay, it's somewhere over in Europe. But Ukraine is very critical because this is a country that, unlike the War of Georgia of 2008, is a country of 3 million. Georgia had a population of 3 million, fought a 4-day war with Russia. Ukraine is a country that have a population of close to 46 million people. Okay, this is a country that, according to the Budapest Memorandum signed at the end of the Cold War, Ukraine gave up 3,000 nuclear weapons. They gave them back to Russia. 3,000. Ukraine is a country that can produce long-range intercontinental ballistic missiles. It is a country that has the capability to develop its own nuclear weapons if it decides to. It hasn't gone that route yet, but it's something that it's a ticking time bomb because of the continuing tensions between Ukraine and the United States. I don't want to spend a lot of time on that issue, but the point here is that there are countries in this part of the world that can affect us. And what happens when this conflict happens, and some people will say it's not our war, it's not for us to get involved in. You know, Americans, if we stay focused on home, that's a very relevant part of the debate. I don't dismiss that at all. But the key thing I want you to come away from tonight seeing is that there's other parts of the world that can affect our interests. And we need to know about that. We need to understand it. You know, there's much about Russia that I've said to you that is very important, but it's interconnected with what Russia's history, and it's also its legacy of the Soviet Union. And what we've seen inside and with the changes that have been occurring in the world, these are affecting us here. And we may not be really aware of it, but it is changing. There's areas like the Black Sea region where Crimea is located, Bulgaria, Romania, Georgia, Turkey. And you look at a map, the Black Sea region is rapidly becoming one of the areas that is becoming very strategically important in terms of the United States. And the things that determine the United States' presence in this part of the world are treaties that remarkably signed from 1934 with the Montreux Convention, something you've never even heard of. But what this convention does is it limits outside naval powers to be able to go into the Black Sea. And why is this important? Because if another conflict comes between Russia and Ukraine, what will happen is the U.S. cannot send its naval forces into that region. It's bound because it's not a signatory of that agreement. So there's a lot of things that are going on, I think, that really weigh in your lives, that weigh in America's decision making. You know, in Washington, we're always looking at the latest trends, what's happening. America has been involved in wars in Afghanistan, now going on over 20 years. You know, since 9/11, and the problem is that Americans, when we were involved in the war in Afghanistan, the American military began focusing on things called counterinsurgency. And what happened during this time is the Russian military kept focusing on other issues like electronic warfare, things like that. The Americans stopped, Cold War's over, and so for us, we stopped looking at these things. And so the Russians developed certain mastery and certain types of weapons and technology that we in the United States just weren't dealing with anymore because we're all fighting insurgents in Afghanistan, and they don't have air defense weapons and shoot back at you and shoot down aircraft. So these are the type of things that kept have the potential to change the way that we're looking at the United States and the way that we interact with this part of the world because of technologies changing. Recently, President Trump just nominated the new U.S. ambassador to Saudi Arabia. His name is General Abizaid. Abizaid is a Lebanese American, speaks Arabic. But for the past 3 years, he's been going to Ukraine once a month on trips and visiting the battlefields of eastern Ukraine. And he came away and he said at an event recently where I was participating, he said, Eastern Ukraine, Donbass, is World War I with technology. And these were things that were very important because the use of drones, GPS jamming, things like that we don't spend a lot of time thinking about, but this is, Ukraine has essentially become like a modern laboratory of weaponry and things like that we just, we haven't been paying attention to in the United States and are going to suddenly one day will affect us. Now, part of my talk today has been, supposed to talk about the impact of the elections, the impact of Russian interference. I really don't want to get involved into a lot of that. The point about the whole thing about interference in the elections and America's role in that is that the Russians have been paying close attention to other aspects of electronic warfare that in our society we don't look at and we don't think about. But they are very trying to key in on the ability to influence people's public opinion and views of the world and try to change our opinion. And now even with this recent elections here in the United States, we're saying that the Russian interference was greater than it has been even during the recent presidential election. So there's a lot of things that are happening in these domains, in the electronic domain, other areas of warfare and technology that are affecting the way that we will interact with Russia. And I've been trying to understand Russia for quite a long time. And there are so many new aspects that I can't even begin to understand some of them. Case in point, in Africa now you're starting to see Russian mercenaries showing up. Companies like, you've heard of America, you've heard of Blackwater, everybody's heard of Blackwater. Well, now there's a Russian company called Wagner. And this company is starting to show up all over the Middle East, in Syria recently. In Syria, there was an attack in Dar al-Zor in eastern Syria. The United States killed over 300 Russians in one day in one battle. This was the greatest number of Russians that were killed by the United States in any conflict. Not even, some people have said it dated back to the U.S. intervention in Russia in 1919. That's how far back this goes. And this group of Russians that was killed were with a mercenary group called Wagner. And now this topic of Russian mercenaries is becoming a very buzzword in Washington, because they're starting to see them showing up in places like Congo. They're showing up in Yemen. They're showing up in different parts of the world, and they're not regular Russian military units, but they're all part of the working for the Russian state, but they're not officially with the Russian state. So these people or soldiers are starting to show up, and now they're dying in these places that are causing us to be able to try to understand and try to figure out how this is going to affect U.S.-Russia relations. In the case of the point in Syria, the United States 3 times tried to call the Russians through the hotline to get them to back off. And they couldn't get the Russians to back off, and they don't know why they kept continuing on, because they were warning, and they were getting closer to the U.S. military bases. We're warning you, you have to stand back, stand down. And they didn't, they kept coming. And luckily, instances like this did not cause a major conflict with Russia, but it certainly has been something that is becoming more of a problem. Now, there's going to be a phrase that you may start hearing more of when U.S. policymakers talk about U.S.-Russia relations, and it's the word deterrence. The word deterrence was a very, very powerful word that was used often during the case of the Cold War, and has now started re-entering the lexicon of the U.S. senior policymakers. And they're using words like to deter Russia. And the point about deterrence is that if you have a strong enough military presence, you will have the ability to deter Russian actions in country X or country Z or wherever in Eastern Europe. Now, this is becoming a very important term in terminology, and the United States is at this crucial point where when they're trying to deal with this new, and if I had a map here, and I apologize to Ruel for not having it, but if you take the Baltic, you know where the Arctic Ocean is, and you swing your arm all the way down, and you go through Eastern Europe all the way through the Baltic, down to the Black Sea to Central Asia, that's what they call the Baltic-Pontic axis. And this is a very important strategic axis, and this is where, this is where the Russian military has been operating and coming in and has the capabilities to interact with the United States in a way that could emerge into a conflict. And why do I talk about that? Well, one of the reasons I wanted to talk about it is because now we're in Mike Gundy country, so this is OSU, and let's see now, there's something called the spread offense, right? Okay, so anybody's played football, the Russians have come up with a concept called nonlinear warfare. Now, what's nonlinear? Well, nonlinear that's what football is. That's when you've got all the guys lining up at the line, or they're going out trying to combat or deter the spread offense. Okay? And Putin is the quarterback, and he's running the spread offense. Okay? And in front of him, all the way from the Arctic down to Central Asia, down the Caucasus, that's his spread offense, and that's where he's going to be. That's the throwing lanes where he's going to be throwing the ball deep and running on the U.S. And why am I saying this? Because in the Cold War, your parents had probably served some military unit in Germany somewhere, or grandparents. But there were at one time in Germany alone, there were 360,000 American troops. Now think about it, 360,000. Wow, that's a lot. The United States now has in Europe, they have around 50,000 men total. And this is the problem, is that the United States is overextended. We don't have the resources. We're not really prepared, but we're moving into a new mindset of where we're trying to deal and figure out where Putin is going to run his spread offense. And I call it the run-pass option, so RPO. Now that is what Putin is trying to do, because now, and you heard me mention Bismarck. Bismarck was well known. You can go to Wikipedia tonight and look him up. Bismarck was well known for something called limited war. And the limited war is designed to go in, you create a conflict, you pause, and then you start negotiations. And it's not, Napoleonic wars were something called total war. World War II, World War I were called total war. But what he's picking is select conflicts around the periphery of Europe to try to engage the United States and try to embarrass the United States and NATO in these areas, and so that in ways that makes us look very weak. And that's why when we try to conceptualize how to deal with this type of problem, is that's the way we have to kind of develop new concepts. Like, Gundy's probably thinking about, okay, what's the game plan for West Virginia? Okay, we're going to, all right, Chubbs, yeah, okay, Chubbs is going to go deep. All right. So this is what trying to conceptualize and develop a game plan is where we are right now. It's what I spend every day talking to people and working in the State Department, Department of Defense. They're trying to come up with new strategies, new ways to deal with security, because they feel that and one of the reasons we pulled out of the INF treaty, you may have heard the intermediate range nuclear treaty that we signed. We just pulled out of that. Russia is heavily investing in mobile ballistic missiles, and so this is becoming a serious issue of a concern, and it's really at the core point of what's happening in U.S.-Russia relations. Now, when President Trump came in to office, the Russians, it was a very interesting story, because the Russians thought that, here this guy is talking to us and he wants to improve relations, and we think that's a great thing. And but at the same time, he appoints these guys like, General Mattis, Mad Dog Mattis, and then he's got H.R. McMaster, National Security Advisor, and McMaster's an Army veteran, and he's the author of a study on Ukraine, lessons learned for the U.S. Army from Russian warfare in eastern Ukraine. So the Russians were trying to figure this out. And so Trump represented something new and different for the Russians, because they were used to Obama. They didn't respect him very much. But then with Trump, he kind of caught them off guard. Then what Trump did was he launched a missile attack in Syria. You may remember that a couple years ago, when early on in his administration, because of the chemical weapons attacks. And then the Russians are like saying, wait a minute, what's up with this president? So, there was what was beginning to happen in U.S.-Russia relations, and then this is what's happened since then, is that Trump has kind of caught the Russians off guard, because on the one hand they want to have good relations, but on the other hand they don't know what to make of him. Now, join the rest of the American population. I mean, we're all trying to figure him out too. But the point is that sometimes, and you're too young to remember, but there was something in the Cold War and during the Vietnam War called the madman theory. And you can Google Trump and madman theory and CNN, and there's a nice little video about that. But the point is that the madman theory was that President Nixon was going to get the North Vietnamese to end the war by bombing Hanoi into rubble, and then that would force them to the negotiating table, blah, blah, blah. So the madman theory was when Trump came in, many people started saying, okay, this is like the madman theory. This is where he's talking and saying nice things, but on the other hand, he's kind of doing some things that are making us nervous. And so this is, if you want to talk about U.S.-Russia relations, this is where we are right now, because on the one hand, you have a president who, when he meets with Putin, gives him all the flatteries, they get along, they can't wait to see each other again, but then they start seeing American troops, and there's a buildup occurring and in Europe, and they're kind of like, well, we don't know what to do about it. For example, they gave Javelin anti-tank weapons to Ukraine. And now they're going to give them Stingers. And so the U.S. has been giving Ukraine very sophisticated weaponry. And so the Russians are saying, like, well, if you really want to get along with us, why are you doing this? And so, but again, that's a part of the new kind of approach taken by the United States of deterrence, that they want to give these countries the ability to defend themselves against Russia. And that's kind of where we're fitting in now. And so when you talk and you look about the future of U.S.-Russia relations, you got to look at kind of the great power dynamics of what Trump represents in his interactions with Putin. And Putin, obviously, in the U.S.-Russia relations today, is still trying to use nuclear weapons, and the idea of us mutually blowing each other up is a way. So, that's why we got to sit down at a table and get along and talk. And so there's all these things that we're seeing, and they don't know how to figure out Trump because of all these advisors that they have around him and by Trump's actions. So when we're trying to look at the future of U.S.-Russia relations, there's all this dynamics that are going into the relationship between us. And we are here sitting in Stillwater talking about it and discussing it. But what's important is that it comes out of all of this is what type of strategy the United States decides that it wants to do in this part of the world and whether it's important to our national interests. And I'm completely open to any debate on that because I think it's a debate that we need to have on this part of the world. But my point before I end and open up the floor to questions is that, there are countries in this part of the world that, like Ukraine, they gave up 3,000 nuclear weapons. And these are people that aren't going to be sitting around waiting on the United States to come and save them someday. And they are people that are ready to go out and defend their interests in a way that they can. And they have the technology and the capabilities to be able to do that. And I was recently in Belarus. And I'll tell you a story about the United States was trying to improve relations with Belarus. And a friend of mine was working at the Pentagon, had to go to his boss. He said, "We want to talk to you about what you're trying to do on Belarus." And he said, well, it's, he went in the guy's office and he said, it's very simple. And he says, you just need to take out a map and look and see where Belarus is located. And he says, that's why we need to engage Belarus, because they're in the middle. And so when I talk about U.S.-Russia relations, I think we need to look at the whole, start looking at maps again. If there's one thing you come out of here tonight, other than learning about Bismarck, is to look at a map, try to figure out what's going on in this part of the world. I hope that you can look at Jamestown and read some of our information material. And I hope, I wish you all the best, the success in your endeavors here and what you do, what you decide you want to do. But obviously you're here tonight because you wanted to hear about U.S.-Russia relations. So there's something tingling in the back of your mind about Russia and the United States. So I hope that I can answer some of your questions, and I'll just open the floor now.
Thank you very, very much for your presentation. And a comment and a question or two. The comment is this, and really to the young people in the room that are draft age and will be for some time, the American citizens in particular, I hope you hear what this man is saying. Because as future voters and leaders of this nation, it's very important that you hear what he has shared. So if you're an American citizen and you're 20, and many of you are, or you're close to that, you're going to be draft age for a long time. Now, question, and full disclosure, my wife's Lithuanian. I have my own series of experiences and biases about that part of the world. Are there elected officials in our Congress who will be there after January 3rd who are listening to voices like yours?
I think they read, I know their staff reads us, okay? And I know that things that the staff will flag for the Congress, for members of Congress, sometimes goes into their speeches. So, excuse me. So, yes, the answer to the question is that they read what we put out. They go to our events, they come to our events, and we give them alerts and notices about certain things that say affecting what's going on in Lithuania and that part of the world. And I would say that they read us religiously, and I'm very happy to be able to say that. But there's a lot of, as I go back to Kissinger's statement, learn everything you can before you go to Washington, because there's no time to think. These people have no time to think. They're rushing off from one meeting to another, and they're making decisions, and they don't know they don't know the implications of what they can't. For example, if they can't put into a historical perspective certain episodes and incidents that fit within the patterns of history, whereas a Russian will tell you that at the Battle of Borodino in 1812 against Napoleon, Yuri Davidov was running behind Napoleon's lines with Russian irregulars. Now what does that mean? That means what in terms of Eastern Ukraine they call hybrid warfare. That is when the Russians were inserting units in behind and dressed as civilians running behind the Ukrainian lines, and they were masquerading as Ukrainians and creating vast confusion. So this is a historical incident of something that matters to contemporary current politics. Now Lithuanians are known for the Forest Brothers because during the Soviet occupation they went to the forests and they fought in a very organized resistance movement against the Soviets. So I've gone on a tangent here, but you get what I'm saying. And why is your point important about draft age? Why? You may have heard it earlier, but I said again, I'm repeating it. There's only 50,000 American troops in Europe. 50. Okay, Russia has close to 500,000 soldiers arrayed against Ukraine. 500,000, 500,000. NATO is developing a new NATO strategy trying to get, it's called the 430 strategy. I won't bore you with the details, but they're trying to get enough combat potential of NATO to be able to deter Russia in some region somewhere. And the point about it is we don't have enough manpower. We don't. We're not ready. And I'm not saying war's around the corner, but we're not ready.
Hello, sir. I'm Daniel Holting. I'm a double major in American Studies and Geography with a focus in geopolitics. And I was wondering, what do you believe we should continue with the new deterrence? Should we continue with new deterrence, arming other countries to fight their battles, or should there still be an increased U.S. presence in surrounding Russia?
You know, some people say, "Oh, this guy up here talking tonight is a Cold Warrior," and I want to say something. There's a libertarian part of me, okay, that says, and there's a part in U.S. thinking now with the case of Ukraine, is that all they want is the weapons to defend themselves. They don't want us to come defend them. But so getting back to your question is that there's starting to be a greater awareness and understanding that we don't have manpower to send to Europe, that these countries should defend themselves. Now, when you talk about Trump and going around Europe and he's saying you got to increase money on defense, he has a point, because the Europeans haven't been spending money. They've been focusing on their economies and doing other things, and they expect us to pay the bills. And I mean, that's a very short kind of, and maybe not an accurate characterization, but what Trump is doing when he talks about other people paying the bills, he's talking about monetizing security. And other nations have monetized their own security by not focusing or paying anything on security. Here's another case in point. They did a test run trying to get American troops to exercises in Poland, and they could not find enough German train cars to deploy these troops to Poland, because the Germans didn't have them available. So if there's a crisis, these guys couldn't get to Europe. So there are things happening, and in geopolitics is very important. I mean, I'm glad you're interested in that topic, but you know, there are a lot of things happening in this area and that are very, very affecting your lives. In a case in point, and I'm not for it, and I'm not against it. I'm neutral on this topic. But beginning March 1st, the U.S. Army is going to decide whether to create a new U.S. military base in Poland. And this is going to have huge repercussions for the United States, because it'll be a first major military base to be installed or deployed or created in Eastern Europe past the Oder River. And this is very, very strategically important, because the Poles are saying to the United States, we're going to give you $2 billion. Okay, $2 billion if you create a base there. And so this is something that Americans are going to have to decide whether it's something we want. Now, Lithuanians, you know, I'm sure they're going to want it. Lithuanian Americans want it, Polish Americans want it, but there's a large segment of our population that won't want it, and they don't want to see that. So these are the things that affect our lives that are going on in Washington. There's debates. You asked a really good question. Hopefully I answered it for you. And there's things you need to be aware of because your voices will matter, and we should have a debate. We should discuss this. Whether we agree or we disagree, we need to discuss it. Questions? Oh, we're going to go left to right, right?
Yeah, we'll bring it back over here the next time.
Okay.
Okay, hi, my name's Caleb. I'm Caleb Reed. I'm actually a pre-law student, but I'm in the English department. And I just wanted to know, to what extent do you think Trump actually formulates his own grand strategy concerning Russia? Do you think he just listens to his advisors and doesn't really have a plan himself? Like, how do you think it would be different if we had any other so-called establishment Republican or even like Hillary in office?
That's a great question. I'm glad you asked it. Trump, like all presidents, has instincts. And there's a story, several members of the Jamestown Foundation Board live in New York, and they would tell stories about Trump would show up at negotiations over business deals, and he would show, and there would be an army of accountants and lawyers in the room, over 30 of them, and he would show up to these negotiations by himself. So why? Because he's supremely confident in his own capabilities, supremely, and he has instincts. And I think he has instincts, and and I'll say another thing, many policymakers kind of follow, they don't know, like Trump probably doesn't know anything about the history of the 2008 war with Georgia or these other episodes. So many policymakers, and I don't fault him for that, many policymakers only have a mental mindset of their past 8 years. Now, many of you in this room are 18, 20 years old, right? So what has formed your life and your history and your knowledge of the world? It's basically what's happened in the last 6, 7 years since you got out of high school and college, right? So your ability to compare and contrast things is very limited. And that's why I was emphasizing the need to read and understand history. Read 5 good books on a particular topic, and you can pretty much get up to speed and have a good conversation about it. Trump doesn't have that. So he does have to rely on his advisors. And some of them, and he likes competition among advisors. And I think if you're any good CEO, you always want to have people that disagree on your team. You don't want everyone to be yes men. You want people to, to have a good, engaged debate and listen to both sides. And I think Trump was like that. Now, I think he went into, and as my own, Trump watching from sitting in Washington, because I have been, I've been intrigued by him because, I actually went through and read The Art of the Deal and trying to understand what the mindset was. But he came into office thinking that he could get good relations with Russia. And that was based upon his instincts and his feelings. He disliked Obama. He was criticizing Obama, saying, Obama would always tell the Russians, say, I'm not going to do this. And Trump was really big. If you watch his videos, he says, never telegraph your intentions to your enemy. Keep them guessing. And so I think that's a part of his if you look at his way that he deals with problems and issues in foreign relations, I think there's that element to it. And then there's this kind of madman element where he's, tweeting away about something some night early in the morning about President Xi of China. Where's that coming from? I mean, he was doing this against Erdogan in Turkey. He was just relentlessly doing it. But now they're getting along, he's making up with Turkey. And so they're, kissing, making up. And so there's certain things about his style of leadership. And you have to go back and look at John F. Kennedy, go back and look at U.S. presidents where they think that they're confident in their capabilities and they have their own knowledge of the world. George Bush had his view of the world, Bush Sr. And so that view of the world kind of formed the way that they would approach it. But Trump came in with the core view of national security as, enough is enough. We're going to stop footing the bill. Others have got to do it. And then guys like Mattis step in and say, well, sir, we need NATO. We've been the anchors of the NATO alliance for years. We can't get out of NATO. Well, and Trump's saying, well, I don't think, I'm not talking about getting out of NATO, but these guys have got to, they're playing us like suckers. And so there's this good cop, bad cop element to the policy of that's where I think you need to kind of fit that in. And there's a lot of CIA analysts that sit around a room, or used to be during the Cold War, and they would watch videos of other foreign leaders giving speeches. And they would read the text of the speech, but they'd watch it and try to analyze it to understand the approach of that leader towards a particular issue. And I encourage everybody, I watch speeches by Mattis. I watch speeches on, I just, Google it on Trump. I try to listen, and then I watch Putin, and try to look at it, because you can gain insight from talking to someone, their ideas and views. But going back to Trump and Putin, I think there's a sincere element that he has of wanting to improve relations with Russia and Putin, and he thinks that he could, and thought he could get down in a room with him and make a deal. But so did Obama. I mean, he thought he could make a deal with Medvedev. Bush W. thought that he could make a deal with. He looked into Putin's soul, and that famous statement. And so. And so he was also. So there's a fallacy of American presidents, I think, that they come in, they don't have a historical knowledge, they base it upon their own instincts, their limited interactions, and they base it upon that. But I, also think that there's an element of Trump that says, the side of him says, man, I can't trust Putin, and I'm not going to give him the freedom to be able to do this. And he showed that in Syria when he attacked Syria with the cruise missiles and for the violation of the use of chemical weapons. So anyway. Yeah, let's go this side.
I got a question on partly relations with China as well. Specifically, how do Russian relations with China affect the Russian relations with the United States?
Well, that's a question your geography professor, Professor Hanks here can. I'm sure he could come off the top of his head and tell you what. There's 5 million Russians now live east of Baikal. So if you take a divisional proportion of Russia in the Far East, and you take how many Chinese, and you take 5 million Russians living past Point X, it's something you're kind of nervous about, especially when they start showing up in encampments inside of Russia, as workers and laborers. So the short answer to your question is that, and I'll tell you what many Pentagon people think, and I happen to agree with it. They believe that in the short term, Russia is the most immediate threat to the U.S., but the most immediate long-term threat to the United States is China. So when you look at the fact that China is developing its own weapons industry and copying Russian weaponry, the long-term Russia is basically a free rider with China as an effort to present itself to the outside world, to the United States, that we've got this great ally, China, and we're going to lie, we're going to align against you, so don't mess with us. But secretly, behind closed doors, they're really wary of the Chinese. And in 1969, they almost, they came this close to fighting a nuclear war between themselves. So it's something that, on the one hand, there's rhetoric and propaganda about how they use and depict China with Russia in a way aligned against the United States. And they really want to go and try to use that for public relations, propaganda reasons to make the United States think that don't mess with us. But there's another part of it too, is they look across the border and they see all the Chinese and they know they know that Russia is very economically weak.
Sir, I noticed that when you're speaking about ways to approach Russia, you only mention troops and bases in Europe. Do you feel like hard power is the only way to address Russia, or do you feel there's still room for public diplomacy?
Oh, I always feel there's room for public diplomacy, but
in what ways?
Well, the problem is that the problem is that they have they've tried to use carrots with Russia on Donbass in Ukraine. So they went into eastern Ukraine, they occupied it, we created an envoy, Kurt Volker. He started going back and meeting with the Russians, trying to resolve the issue. And just earlier this week, or yesterday, the Russians had elections in Donbass, and they created their own officials and whatever for the local government. So the U.S. has tried to engage Russia because I think that Trump is sincere, that he knows that if they can resolve Donbass and the conflict in Ukraine and get the Russians to militarily withdraw, that the U.S. would consider removing sanctions. Now you got to remember that sanctions was a concept that Joe Nye of Harvard University came up with in the 90s. he came up with this because at the end of the Cold War, America was supreme and everybody else was beneath us, and we were the major power. So we will force nations that don't behave well, we'll penalize them with sanctions. We use it against Saddam Hussein in Iraq, and we continue to use it against Iran. So sanctions remains a favored tool of U.S. diplomacy. But the problem now is that we've been using that tool and trying to engage the Russians on Donbass to try to get a deal to do something, pull back, bring in UN monitors, do something, and it hasn't worked. Because all they care about is trying to make Ukraine suffer and trying to make Ukraine weak. And that is a part of a kind of a wider plan. And these are the facts. I mean, they have tried. I mean, they've tried to get them to do this. Georgia fought a war with Russia in 2008, and their territory was seized and annexed by Russia. So when I talk about these military issues, that's a point of deterrence, is that you're trying to get your opponent to behave in a way that he doesn't go in another continued type of reckless behavior. And that's kind of the point. And there are groups at Stanford now that are meeting U.S.-Russia relations and what they call Track 2 negotiations. And I've talked to some of the people in those negotiations, and they are sitting down and trying to talk. But the Russian mindset right now is so filled full of these ideas of grand imperial power and desire for greater, Russia, that they're not going anywhere. They can't. They keep trying to do this, And even when Putin talks to Trump, they're trying to come up with an idea, some way of engagement, and it's not working. But I support it. Yeah, sure.
Hi, thank you. My name is Ethan Sample. I'm a strategic communications major, and with deterrence growing in importance, I was wondering if you believe that information warfare and narrative warfare is a more vital form that undermines physical confrontation with Russia in the growing future, kind of like what they've done with our election, and it's a part of a toolkit. They have a toolkit. And information operations is a way to make you change your mind about, they have various mechanisms for doing that. They've created Russia Today television. They're quite effective at it, and bottom line is we're not any good at it. I mean, we've been trying, we've been throwing a lot of money at this issue, and there's a lot of debates in the U.S. government about how ineffective they are in combating and deterring the Russians in information. And the best professionals around are the British. And they have the expertise and have years and built an empire and understand how to use propaganda and information in a way. They did it against Hitler. And so we were newcomers to World War II in that area. So we are way behind in how and it also creates constitutional questions about American interference, But they don't have that problem, They can tweet their little hearts away or troll their hearts away. I mean, they've got guys in warehouses in St. Petersburg, hi, I'm Joe Smith, I'm here at OSU, and boy, OSU's going to get run over by West Virginia. They see them on the chat rooms. And it's a part of psychological warfare. And now I'm not saying the U.S. doesn't do it, because the U.S. Army and U.S. military in Europe have people that do that. But boy, the Russians are doing cartwheels around us. Go ahead, follow up.
Would you say that is a growing investment that our military is actually investing in for professionals coming out of college?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, information operations is a completely new, new field. I mean, it's certainly. I mean, information operations is, is a way. And there's a lot of literature on the internet. You can go to a lot of places and find this material. And understand it but the Russians are very, very sophisticated. And what is sad is in the United States, we don't have ability to we haven't really identified and outlined what that information is. How to deter it. And I've got Russian analysts that write for Jamestown, and they are just, they can write a whole novel about ways that the Russians are using this, and it's very, very sophisticated down to, to doctrine and things like that. And I think we're kind of really way behind because we've been so long fighting the Taliban off in the mountains that we don't kind of understand this. And it's been a problem even since the Iraq War. So And I mean, when the U.S. invaded Iraq in 2003, they had a problem in dealing with Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And now Al-Qaeda in Iraq is now Islamic State. So it's a problem, and a lot of people, now in Europe and in the Baltic, the most advanced countries in fighting Russian information warfare are the Estonians. And they are like the Jedi Knights of information warfare. And if you go to, I think the Estonian Ministry of Defense website, you'll find there's in the Baltic, I think it's Baltic Defense College, but they've just got tons and tons of stuff. I mean, these people are very, very sophisticated in their understanding. And unlike the Cold War, we've got a lot of good allies and people like in the Baltic states that understand how the Russians think and do in their modus operandi.
One final question.
One final? Okay.
How did your time at Oklahoma State prepare you for the career you've had?
I think that I had professors who cared for me and took a personal interest in my life, and that mentored in the ways that they had, and tried to encourage it and say, you know, there's this program at Ohio State University, and if you apply for it, you can go study in Moscow. But in order to do that, you have to get your Russian level up to level 3 or 4. And in order to do that, you may have to go to Indiana University and study intensive Russian. So there were people who quietly encouraged me along the way. And then I kept meeting very interesting, dynamic people. And you always find somebody somewhere in your life that will try to mentor you. And we all had people like that. And I was very blessed that Oklahoma State, you know, just kind of opened up the world. I didn't say push me in a particular direction, but it opened up the world through the professors who would come and give lectures and point at maps and talk about things. I was like, oh man, that's really interesting. You know, I really don't want to go back to Shoe Warehouse and be a manager with a business management degree. That's why I was like, man, that's what I was serious. I was getting ready to graduate from OSU, and I always been interested in history and political science. And then we had this dynamic professor who started teaching me Russian. He said, you know, my goal in this class is to make you learn Russian so well that we can drop you behind Russian lines and you'll pass as a Russian. And I was like, oh, that's really cool. So, you know, so there were people like that who kind of said, you know, and I was sitting around watching TV and seeing all the talk shows, and I became interested in foreign policy. You know, and everybody picks up an issue of foreign affairs every now and then and reads it and thinks, I'm now an expert in foreign affairs. But, you know, you read this stuff, it develops a mindset. But the key thing was always having a mentor or someone to encourage you. And I think Oklahoma State offered that because I think there's a free environment here for thinking. It's certainly not like the University of Kansas where they have more established programs. But, you know, this is a feeder school. This will feed you. You know, you will go on to somewhere in point X in your life, whether it's GW or Georgetown, or Indiana University, to get further career, you know. But I encourage everybody to be, you know, that don't think that there's a wall between you and the East Coast and the West Coast and the Heartland, because when you go, you know, Washington D.C. is like Stillwater. You got your little elite groups. You've got some people hang out with these people, and there's this frat house down here, and they got this, and everybody knows each other. And Washington D.C. is like that. You know, you stay there long enough, you start to know, and you go to all the events, you start to know all these people. So then the social networking becomes one where you're integrated into that social network like you were here at OSU, except that's a social network for foreign affairs. And through that, a lot of doors will open to you. I mean, I'm very lucky. I got to be a chance to work for 4 years with Dr. Zbigniew Brzezinski, and that was just, you know, you can't, you know, I did, you know, part of it I did it for free. So, you know, so this is the type of thing that and people go to Washington and get jobs and unpaid interns, you know. I mean, we just hired someone at Jamestown that was a graduate from the War Studies School at University of North Carolina, and he had worked as an unpaid intern in the summer and kept in touch. You know, he showed an interest, and he kept coming back, and so we ended up hiring the guy, and he's been fantastic. And I try to hire at Jamestown. I always look for people from outside of DC, because I try to go outside the existing social networks, because I want people who are young and hungry, you know, who want to climb the ladder.